Everyone talks about summer like it's supposed to be carefree. But if this season brings up money stress, body stress, family stress, or social stress, that's real too. Growth therapy can help with that. Whether it's your first time in therapy or your 50th, Grow makes it easier to find a therapist who fits you, not the other way around. They connect you with thousands of independent licensed therapists across the U.S., offering both virtual and in-person visits, nights and weekends. You can search by what matters, like insurance, specialty, identity, or availability, and get started in as little as 2 days. And if something comes up, you can cancel up to 24 hours in advance at no cost. There are no subscriptions, no long-term commitments. You just pay per session. Grow helps you find therapy on your time. Whatever challenges you're facing, Grow Therapy is here to help. Grow accepts over 100 insurance plans, including Medicaid in some states. Sessions average about $21 with insurance, and some pay as little as $0 depending on their plan. Visit growtherapy.com/booknow to get started. That's growtherapy.com/booknow. growtherapy.com/booknow. Availability and coverage by state and insurance plan.
History as it happens. It's April 14th, 1775, 5 days before the battles of Lexington and Concord. And there's a small gathering inside the Sun Tavern in Philadelphia. As Sean Wilentz writes, in No Property in Man, organized anti-slavery politics originated in America. On that day in April 1775, 10 Philadelphians, 7 of them Quakers, founded the first anti-slavery society in world history. The group disbanded during the war, but in 1784, the Revolution won. It reorganized as the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery, and by the end of 1790, at least 7 more statewide anti-slavery societies had appeared, from Rhode Island to as far south as Virginia. When the Federal Convention met in Philadelphia in 1787, Wilentz writes, 5 northern states, as well as the Republic of Vermont, had either effectively banned slavery outright or passed gradual emancipation laws, commencing the largest emancipation of its kind to that point in modern history. This is the 6th installment in my America250 series. The semiquincentennial is less than 2 weeks away. And this episode's about an underappreciated aspect of the American Revolution, a war fought for fundamental human rights as articulated in the Declaration of Independence. I mean, everyone knows the names Washington and Jefferson, but what about the early abolitionist Anthony Benezet, or Mum Bet, or Quock Walker, or Samuel Hopkins? Sean Wilentz teaches history at Princeton University. He is one of the great historians in our country, the author of the aforementioned No Property in Man and the Rise of American Democracy. And he's now writing a book about this subject. Sean Wilentz, welcome back to the podcast. It has been too long.
Been too long. Great to be here, Martin.
America250 on the way. Before we get to that, I want to ask you to share your thoughts on Gordon Wood.
Yes, Gordon Wood. It's a great loss. If there was an untimely death of a 92-year-old, it was Gordon, because he was very much active out there. I just did a gig at the New York Public Library with Daniel Allen, who's got a new book out, and the very first blurb is from Gordon, talking about how wonderful the book is. Look, he was one of the great historians ever of the United States, certainly the premier historian of the era of the American Revolution for a long time, and he was still going strong. You know, sometimes when senior scholars pass on, when they die, that's, you want to honor everything they've done. What I'm missing is all the stuff that Gordon was still going to do that we're going to miss out on. So, and he was also a great, what should we say? He stood up at various times in recent years, not only over 1619, but a bunch of stuff with great fortitude and knowing more in his little finger than most of his adversaries will ever know forever. For all of these reasons, it's a terrible blow, and I mourn his death.
And we'll get to some of those issues because they do concern what we're going to discuss here about anti-slavery and the American Revolution. But one other question about Gordon. How did he influence your work?
Gordon? Well, I mean, look, you couldn't have come up when I came up in the 1970s, 1980s with that first reading, Creation of the American Republic, and it was an astounding piece of work. It rearranged our whole way of thinking of where American Revolution came from, what its ideas were, especially in terms of political theory and political ideas and the Constitution as well. It was the great book of that period. And then he writes Radicalism, which reclaimed, I mean, in funny ways, creation ends on a kind of Thermidorian note in the sense that the Constitution kind of undid a lot of what the revolution was about. But with radicalism, you really got the sense of his reclaiming what a previous generation had denied, which was the radicalism of the revolution. For a long time, historians were saying the revolution was essentially a conservative affair, that it was trying to conserve English liberties or being taken away from them, that it was not really a social revolution in any shape, manner, or form. Gordon said that it was a social revolution, not a social revolution like the French Revolution, not a social revolution the way that some people thought about it, but that it was a transformative event in the history of the Western world in terms of overthrowing ideas about monarchy and aristocracy that had been around forever. So in terms of my work, I came in it from a different angle than Gordon. Gordon was mostly interested in what was going on at the top in politics. And when I started out, I was interested more in what was going on at a different level in politics. At first, it didn't have as much to do with my specific work as it did with my general view of things. But then when radicalism came out, and I started working more at a different level of studying American politics, it kind of conjoined much more. We didn't agree about everything, but we agreed about a lot.
The Rise of American Democracy by one Sean Wilentz. It is my favorite American history book. It totally changed the way I think about democracy.
Wow. Well, that's strong praise coming from you, Martin. And but I got more to do too. So
Yes.
am
I
that
allowed
was
to?
25 years ago. Let's keep going.
Am I allowed to ask about the next book? C-SPAN just did an hour-long special with Robert Caro. That was great. One of the first questions the reporter got out of the way so they can get on with the interview was asking Robert Caro when the final volume of the LBJ series will be out. There was no answer forthcoming. Sean Wilentz, you're working on this great book.
I'm a little bit different than Bob Caro. You never promise to do something and then and then take a long time to do it, which he promised a long time ago. I never promised to write this volume, but I suppose I'm stuck with it. I'm trying to finish it off this year. I have the year off to do it, and I'm well into it. It's called The Fall of American Slavery. It's the companion volume to The Rise of American Democracy. It's the story of how slavery in this country, but then of course elsewhere, but mostly in this country, went from being a institution that was taken for granted, that was implanted by the Stuart monarchy in particular, how it came undone in the course of 150 years.
Do Americans know this story well enough? Why don't they know this story? Why?
Most studies of the American Revolution didn't talk about slavery very much for a very long time. It was a familiar story or unfamiliar story, but the characters tended to be the same, no matter what you thought about them. And it was the founders and the revolutionaries and the patriots, and it was Sam Adams, and it was all that stuff. Slavery was kind of put to the side. And then, of course, when slavery studies recommenced, or took a different direction, rather, starting in the 50s and 60s, there was a great hue and cry about why the revolution didn't do more about slavery than people thought it could have done. How could you have a revolution that was predicated in the idea that all men are created equal and still have slavery persist? So slavery was thought of as a great contradiction. And indeed, many said that slavery, the continuation of slavery, was the revolution's darkest legacy. And then some have said, in fact, more recently, that the American Revolution was essentially pro-slavery. So it's taken time for those two things to catch up with each other. In other words, to see how the radicalism of the American Revolution, in fact, included the beginnings of the first anti-slavery political movement in the history of the world. It wasn't the same thing as the American Revolutionary cause by any means. It was hand in hand with it.
And we'll get to slavery's place during the war on all sides of the conflict, patriots, Tories, the British. We'll get to that in a minute. I mean, you write here on page 25 of No Property in Man, organized anti-slavery politics. Again, organized anti-slavery politics. You don't say anti-slavery sentiment or attitudes. Organized politics originated in America in 1775, 5 days before Lexington and Concord. 10 Philadelphians, 7 of them Quakers, founded the first anti-slavery society in world history. The Society for the Relief of Free Negroes Unlawfully Held in Bondage. I heard they had trouble fitting all that on a business card. But let's talk, though. Let's wind the clock back just a little bit. Before the Revolutionary War, if there weren't a politics, what would you call it? Criticisms of slavery? Who were these people? What was it?
Well, there actually were politics beforehand, but not in that sense of there being an organized, society or something. That was the first of its kind. in the modern history, as far as I know, certainly in the history of the Atlantic world. But there were politics going on. I mean, back up even further. I mean, there were politics inside the Quaker connection going back to the 1680s. And there were attempts, fitful attempts by Quaker abolitionists to get at least the Quaker connection to drop its association with slavery, which in fact succeeded. It took a while. There are important moments in that history. In 1758, there was an important decision by the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting. By 1776, Quakers have broken their connection with slavery. You cannot be a good Quaker and be a slaveholder at the same time. So in that very narrow but nevertheless influential and important stream, there was anti-slavery politics of a kind going on. People like John Woolman, Anthony Benezet, somewhat later on, were spreading ideas, but they were getting into action as well, at least within the Quaker connection. By the time we get to the 1760s, there actually is, within the Colonial Assembly in Massachusetts in particular, there was debate over the getting rid of slavery altogether. There were petitions being delivered by enslaved people in Boston in 1773, 74, even before the Revolution breaks out. So there's a kind of politics, but it doesn't get as much notice, I think, because it's restricted to particular colonies, as it would have had to have been in this period. There's also agitation against the slave trade, and that is much more colony-wide. Most of the colonies come up with petitions, one kind or another, petitioning the Crown to end the slave trade. And of course, the Crown denies that because the Crown thinks the slave trade is just great. So I don't want to make it sound as if there isn't activity and political activity. There is political activity before the Revolution, but there's something that happens in 1775, which is going to take it in a different direction.
Sure. What's inspiring this early activity? Is it Enlightenment philosophy? Is it religious belief?
Both, all. The Quakers obviously have the reputation justly for having been in the vanguard of all of that. We can go back even further if you want to, and maybe I should. In 1652, the very first abolitionist ordinance in the Atlantic world is passed in Providence, Rhode Island, Providence Plantation, overseen by a man named Samuel Gorton, who was an English revolutionary who came over, a very radical guy, very radical egalitarian. And a lot of these ideas are actually being debated inside the English Revolution in the 1640s and 1650s. Because after all, slavery was a monarchical institution. It's only going to become more so after the overthrow of Cromwell and the beginnings of the commencement of the Stuart monarchy. There's lots going on in terms of ideas and even political efforts. Now, that ordinance in Providence lasted all of about 6 months, and Rhode Island is going to become the biggest slave trading colony in British North America. So there's irony to all of that, and it doesn't happen all of a sudden by any means. But, there are these efforts. You can see it there fairly early on, much earlier on than I think most Americans understand. That said, the religious strain, in Gorton's case, he was an English radical of no particular connection. He was a religious radical, but he wasn't a Quaker or anything. The Quakers come out of the radicalism of the English Revolution. They toned themselves down somewhat in the 1670s after the Restoration. But nevertheless, the anti-slavery strain is there, and then it really takes off in the American colonies first in the 1680s. So there's a religious aspect to that. The Quakers believe that the inward light dictates that no person can own another person. It is simply man stealing, and it is blasphemous, and it is something that they cannot sustain on religious terms, and it has a very heavy religious aspect to it.
Yeah, I remember reading Bartolome Las Casas, if I'm getting his name right, during the time.
Well, that's right. I mean, there are, even before the Quakers, Las Casas, there are all these objections to slavery, although Las Casas thought it was just fine to enslave American Indians and and not bring the Africans over. You can find bits and pieces, going back a long way.
Yeah, I mean, these ideas do not originate with Thomas Jefferson's pen. Speaking of Gordon Wood, I just happened to watch a talk he gave on YouTube last year because I did an episode about Gordon. So I was watching some of his recent talks, and he mentioned how Jefferson, his ideas were not original in the Declaration, of course, but he was writing what had been conventional wisdom about Lockean natural rights. But, there's a difference between criticizing slavery, but not attacking the right to own slaves. There were critics like this who thought that slaves should just be treated better. The Quakers were different, right? They said that there's no good way to own a slave, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
That's correct. You cannot have property in other human beings. The property rights do not extend that far. You go back to John Locke, and Locke has very complicated ideas about slavery. He doesn't like slavery, although people think that he did. But once you get to the idea of natural rights in that sense, and the egalitarianism of natural rights, it will come into conflict with rights to property. And this is always a problem for a lot of the so-called natural rights theorists about slavery, is because you have these things that are in conflict. How can you have secure rights of property, at the same time be anti-slavery because slavery is a form of property that was, what should we say? It was legal at one point. How can you suddenly declare it to be illegal at another point? And that was something that people who didn't like slavery very much had to contest with. There were a lot of other issues as well. I mean, how do you end this institution that's based on violence so suddenly and not expect there to be violence in return? And
Yeah.
there's a lot of reasons why people hedge on all of this. It isn't simply a matter of self-interest.
Though, no right is absolute. So, yes, I have a right to own property, but it's not an absolute right. So maybe is
Well,
that one way they attacked?
what it became was whether the property in human beings is legitimate or not.
Yeah.
It's not a question of the extent of property rights. The question is what is property, and that's really the heart of the matter. Sure, you have eminent domain. You have all sorts of ways in which governments can interfere with property rights. Yeah, that's all true. But the nub of the matter is whether you can have any kind of, either on Christian terms or on Enlightenment terms, whether there is any legitimacy to one person owning another person.
Yeah.
And that was the nub of the issue throughout. And the defenses of slavery very much depended upon the property question. They said, look, slaveholders said, this is our property. How can you take away our property? People who were opposed to them said, well, no, you may think it's your property, but that property is illegitimate, so you cannot continue.
It's important that we're going over this because to anyone listening today, well, I shouldn't say anyone because you never know, but to any sane, decent person today, the idea of owning another person is, of course, unthinkable. Not for most of the human experience.
Well, there are various kinds of
Yes.
slavery, to be sure, and that kind of domination goes back millennia. This is what's so extraordinary about the book, I think, the subject of what I'm writing about, which is that slavery was an institution that in one form or another had existed for millennia, including in the classical republics, which is one of the reasons why some of the pro-slavery people were able to square, American republicanism with slavery, in that they say, well, look at Rome, look at the Roman, look at the Greek, all of that.
The fact that this has been around for millennia and now it's being challenged.
All of a sudden, in the twinkling of Cleo's eye, I mean, you go from a place where slavery is accepted pretty much as a natural state of affairs. Inside of, what should we say, 100 years, 200 years, it goes from being perfectly natural to being, in many people's eyes, perfectly unnatural. In historical terms, that's really quite extraordinary. It's a moral revolution, if you will, a political revolution, a legal revolution, but also essentially a moral revolution. To my mind, is one of the most extraordinary things in all of history.
So how does the American Revolution trigger this? Sounds like an obvious question, but
the most obvious thing is that, how can you be fighting for the Declaration of Independence and counting slavery? And there were some who said you could, but there are many who said you couldn't. In the lead up to the revolution, there were those like James Otis in Boston and others who were already making this point. They were not yet at the point of declaring American independence, but they nevertheless were fighting against what they thought of as British oppression of one kind or another. And they took the next logical step, which is to say that we cannot talk about attaining our freedom without looking to the freedom that we are denying the enslaved. And by the way, and also not just those people, James Otis and others, but also the enslaved. I mean, as I said, there were these petitions that were coming out as early as the 1770s, before Lexington and Concord. There was a man named Felix Holcomb in Boston who got a bunch of his people to sign petitions to the royal government, to the royal governor in Massachusetts, demanding something be done. They were very deferential in many ways, but in some ways they were not. And that strain continues too, of free blacks and enslaved people also demanding their freedom, saying, in effect, we support the American Revolution, it's all fine, but you have to take the next step as well. That whole strain is something that I think Americans know very little about, and they ought to know more about.
yeah, I mean, to relate to this, we might want to think of any major issue today where moral suasion, because this begins with moral suasion, right? Where moral suasion doesn't work and you're vexed, you're frustrated, you're trying to explain to somebody to see the light. How can you possibly defend this position? It's immoral and they just don't want to see it your way. So that was a tough task dealing with an institution such as slavery that had been around for so long.
Well, it depended, though, Martin, about what you thought the political possibilities were. If you saw politics as so blocked that it was impossible to imagine that legislators would actually get rid of slavery, which, was not always the case. But when politics seemed blocked, then the only recourse that you had was to try to persuade others, through the churches in particular, to point out the contradiction, between Christ's message, let alone Jefferson's message, and the institution of slavery.
And you might get an
you could
individual, sorry to interject, you might get an individual slaveholder to free his slaves on his own, but you still need the politics, right, to get at the base of the institution itself.
There's a difference between manumission and abolition. You can see manumission as being a step towards abolition, that the more slaveholders are persuaded through moral suasion or what have you, maybe even economics, to give up on owning their slaves, that would be a step towards making that possible. And in some parts of the country, that was important. In 1782, Virginia passes a very much more liberalized manumission law that some people thought of was a big step towards abolition. Turned out not to be the case. That's a whole other story. But there's a fundamental difference, yes, between making it more possible for people to free the enslaved and abolishing slavery altogether. They're two different propositions.
Sure. I found this excellent article at allthingsliberty.com on anti-slavery politics and the initial attack on the slave trade. The article cites a historian we all know, David Bryan Davis. He wrote, by the eve of the American Revolution, there was a remarkable convergence of cultural and intellectual developments, which at once undercut traditional rationalizations for slavery and offered new modes of sensibility for identifying with its victims. New modes of sensibility.
Well, that comes with the Enlightenment as well. It's not simply about rationality. It's also about understanding that, it goes back to the golden rule in some ways, which is religious. Do unto others as you do unto you. Well, you cannot do unto others and be a Christian, a good Christian, and at the same time enslave them. And you need to identify in ways that Professor Davis, who indeed was my doctoral advisor, pointed out a new sense of sympathy, of empathy for the slaves that went beyond anything that had happened before. So it's not simply about protecting your own self-interest, but it's understanding that the interests of humanity are at stake here as well.
It's an amazing thing, history, how something that could be around for centuries or millennia, but in this context, human chattel slavery, race-based human chattel slavery in the British colonies was around for a while. And now suddenly this thing that had been there for so long just seems old, antiquated. Just to cite this article, this process of anti-slavery was advanced by increasing capitalism. As free labor became more common, other labor means, indentured servitude, debt bondage, and slavery, came increasingly to appear antiquated and anomalous. So do you agree with that? There's a linkage between the rise of capitalism and the end of slavery, or the
sort of, but I think actually David overstated that because a lot of the anti-slavery activity is hardly pro-capitalist.
Sure.
It's coming from below. It's coming from people who have, who actually don't go all the way back to a guy named Benjamin Lay, a dwarf vegetarian agitator in the 1730s. They're not pro-capitalist by any means. They are for free labor, but that's not the same thing as capitalism. They don't think that people should be enslaved to others. People should be free to do make their own independent way in the world. I think of slavery as essentially a monarchical institution rather than anything else. There are two great revolutions that are going on. One is the anti-monarchical, other is the anti-slavery. And insofar as slavery is essentially a monarchical institution, it's going to raise all kinds of questions in people's minds about its legitimacy once the anti-monarchical revolution gets started. That's a complicated matter. But I see things much more in that light rather than in terms of capitalism and free labor. This is a big argument that historians have all the time, and I don't want to I don't think you have the time today to go through that entire debate. There are those, to be sure, that you can see as proto-capitalist, whatever, but I don't see that connection explains as much about the moral revolution that you're talking about as some people think.
Sure. Anti-slavery is the natural position to be in when you're fighting a revolution based on natural rights, getting rid of monarchy. However, we know, of course, that many, 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 many colonists had no intention of ending slavery. They wanted to grow the institution. We have to
Some people did. Yeah. Again, I'm more skeptical of that than others. I mean, I think most people, certainly in South Carolina and Georgia, they had no intention whatsoever of affecting slavery. They wanted to keep slavery, that slavery was perfectly compatible with the idea of the Declaration, as long as you didn't include African slaves as being created equal. However, what you do see steadily, particularly in northern New England at first, but then more gradually, but then in the middle colonies as well, a realization that you cannot have these two things together. And it is not for nothing that the very first abolition laws, in the Atlantic world and legislatively, I think possibly even in the history of all humanity, come out of Pennsylvania, and then they come out of Connecticut, and they come out of Rhode Island. They are not immediate emancipation laws, to be sure. That wasn't in the cards by any means. But nevertheless, something is happening in the United States, or what's going to become the United States, that is really quite extraordinary.
I want to get to the Northern emancipation in a bit, but finish your point.
Well, my point is simply that if you were standing in 1760, you would imagine that as much would be done in terms of anti-slavery by 1790 as actually happened, quite apart from the achievement of American independence, you would have been astounded. Anthony Benezet is struggling to get this together in 1760 or so. He's a great Philadelphia Huguenot emigre abolitionist who's kind of the one-man band in some ways, but he gets people connected all across the Atlantic world to oppose slavery. If you had told him that by 1780, the place that he was living, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, would have passed a gradual emancipation law, he would have been very happy, but he would have been somewhat surprised. This all happened, really quite rapidly, I think.
Yeah.
It's more interesting to me, in fact, that there was as much anti-slavery in the American colonies as there was pro-slavery. Given what we talked about before, the suddenness with which slavery suddenly becomes illegitimate, that is the unusual thing, not the fact that America tolerates slavery and keeps it going for a very long time. To me, the anti-slavery revolution is much more impressive.
Tap subscribe now in the show notes to skip ads, enjoy early access, and listen to all of our bonus content. Or go to historyasithappens.com. Signing up takes 2 minutes.
Hey guys, finding the perfect gift for the food lover in your life is easy, thanks to Goldbelly. Goldbelly ships America's most iconic foods, straight from world-famous restaurants right to your door. So if you want to treat someone to Joe's Stone Crab from Miami, Franklin Barbecue from Texas, or desserts from famous foodies like Ina Garten or Martha Stewart, Goldbelly has you covered. Just go to goldbelly.com and for a limited time, get 20% off your first order with promo code GIFT. That's promo code GIFT.
You can never have too many tools. Shop DeWalt deals at Lowe's. Get a free Select DeWalt 20-volt max power tool when you buy a Select 20-volt max 5-amp-hour battery kit. Plus, get a free additional DeWalt 20-volt max 8-amp-hour battery when you buy a DeWalt 10-inch 20-volt max dual-bevel compounded miter saw. Our best lineup is here at Lowe's. Valid through 6/24 while supplies last. Selection varies by location.
And we'll get to your essay you wrote in the New England Quarterly a couple of years ago, The Radicalism of Northern Abolition, to talk about why that was so important. The slave trade in the 1770s, how important is the transatlantic slave trade to the maintenance, the continuation of slavery in the colonies?
The colonists don't want to have the slave trade anymore. In fact, they get rid of it in 1774 when they finally begin the move towards independence. As part of the anti-importation business with Britain, they suspend importation of slaves as part of everything else, as part of the grand boycott. So there's a great deal of resistance to the slave trade, not in South Carolina, not in Georgia, but even in Virginia. Virginia petitions the Crown to stop the slave trade. Why? Because they think they have enough enslaved people anyway, and they think it's not always a humanitarian reason. Bringing more Africans over has increased the likelihood of insurrection. So there's that reason, but there are those who also say that the slave trade is the most beastly aspect of the institution of slavery. The kidnapping of untold millions of Africans and bringing them across in the way that they did, to suffer in the way they did, only to be sold off to the highest bidder, that this was something that they could not stomach. Even people who could abide slavery cannot abide the slave trade. So the feeling was that we have enough enslaved people here already, we don't need the slave trade anymore. And so you do get these petitions, and the colonies really want to try to end it. There is opposition within among the colonists, to be sure. It's by no means uniform. The reason it doesn't get stopped primarily is because the British Crown doesn't think it's a very good idea.
I mentioned this article before at allthingsliberty.com. It was written by Christian McBurney. He says here, in the course of 4 centuries, British merchants carried an astounding number of Africans across the Atlantic, estimated at 3.2 million. You mentioned Samuel Hopkins, I believe, before, who was a Congregationalist minister. Yeah, he and his fellow anti-slavery people thought the first thing, or one of the first things they should go after, was the slave trade itself.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's not for nothing that the slave trade is ended in 1807, 1808 in the United States, as it is in Britain, decades before slavery itself. There was a feeling among some that if you managed to halt the slave trade, that slavery would follow. And in some of the colonies, indeed, that made sense. And then back up again. I mean, understand that the vast majority of the British imports, if that's the right word, of enslaved Africans was being sent not to the British North American colonies, but to the West Indies. Then again, Brazil was the great recipient of large numbers of enslaved Africans. So by comparison, the numbers that are coming to British North America are fairly small.
And the Portuguese.
That's not any way to exonerate what's going on in British North America, simply to say that the balance of the trade was going elsewhere. And Britain was, especially after 1712 or so, was the great slave trading nation on earth. No question about it. They were making a lot of money Individual slave traders were making a lot of money off of that, and it was a very powerful interest. But in terms of, yes, many people thought that if you ended the slave trade, that slavery would follow. Now, that turned out to be not true. I mean, as it happens in history, things, unintended consequences, but also unforeseen events will change the nature of things, so that in the United States ended the slave trade with Africa, the transatlantic slave trade, and there's still smuggling going on. I don't want to make it sound as if it all ended, but the law ended the slave trade in 1808. And yet, as we know, slavery only flourished in the southern United States thereafter. That could not be foreseen, in part because the Cotton Revolution wasn't foreseen, and what some historians call the second slavery, that slavery was kind of reinvented towards the end of the 18th century, was going to mean that simply ending the slave trade itself was not going to be slavery's death knell. Certainly not in the United States.
No, there were, 4 million slaves by the eve of the Civil War in a country of roughly 30 million people. So it's understandable why so many abolitionists, such as William Lloyd Garrison, got so frustrated with the political system, he burned a facsimile of the Constitution. We've talked about Garrison in the past. So during the Revolutionary War itself, this is where there's been so much confusion lately, caused in large part by the 1619 Project's erroneous claim, tendentious claim, that the American Revolution was fought to preserve slavery. So I know that we've discussed this before. I don't really want to have to relitigate this all over again, but I think it's important because not everyone, listens to every episode, and this is still out there. You can still see this out there.
Yeah.
In Virginia, the Dunmore Proclamation, that was done to try to restore order in a colony that had already gone the way of revolution. Is that your position?
Correct.
Did any significant number of colonists change sides or get off the fence and go to the revolutionary side, the patriot cause, because of Dunmore?
It might have been some. There's some evidence that people were so angry at the British for having done this that they switched their allegiances, or they became more in favor of independence. They might have been on the fence about independence. Yeah. There's some evidence about that, but that doesn't mean that they're fighting the revolution in order to preserve slavery. Mm-hmm. And there was no question that what Dunmore was doing had nothing to do with abolishing slavery. There was a military aspect. You free the enslaved in order to get at the people that you want to get at, who in the case of in Virginia were the Virginia Patriots. It's a last-ditch effort to try to turn things around. You were going to tell all of the enslaved people of patriots, not of loyalists. Loyalists could keep their slaves, but of patriots, that you were going to free them and they were going to turn against you. Now, it worked up to an extent. I mean, look, if you're an enslaved person in Virginia and someone's offering you freedom, you're going to take advantage of it, no matter who it is. Dunmore enlisted his Ethiopian regiment, and they fought somewhat disastrously, but nevertheless they fought. But the idea that this had anything to do with the future of slavery itself as an institution is preposterous. It was a very cynical military move on the part of the British, who were in desperate shape. I mean, look, this point, Lord Dunmore is no longer, he's on a boat outside of Norfolk trying to run the colony and trying to restore order to the colony. This is a desperate move. He'd already started along these lines some months before, but nevertheless, this was his desperate move. Now, it ticked a lot of people off, and you can find a lot of people saying this is a horrible thing. We hate the British for doing this, blah, blah. But that is not as if they're trying to preserve slavery. They had no question that slavery was going to continue, at least in the short run. It wasn't that the British were threatening it. There was not much abolitionism in Britain per se anyway at this point.
And in Virginia, Virginia had already revolted.
Yeah, but Virginia was out of control. That's why desperate steps were taken in order to try to preserve it. It's not as if this was the cause of the Virginia revolt. The Virginia was in revolution already.
Yeah, I've heard the argument that this is how the Revolutionary War got to the South. That without this, the war would never have reached the southern colonies. I don't know if that's right. I think the British...
I don't know where you've heard that. That's bizarre.
The British turned to the South because the campaign in the northern colonies, middle colonies, failed, I understand.
They went to the South because of Saratoga.
Yeah.
They went to the South because, they could not defeat... They were hoping they could use a pincer movement between Canada and New York, and they cut the colonies off. The New England cut off from the middle colony. It didn't work. They lost.
And they also thought there would be more Tories in the South. That didn't turn out to be the case either.
Well, that turned out to... There are a lot of reasons why things turned out in the South the way they did, but it's not as if all of a sudden they wanted to free the slaves. I mean, that's crazy. The military history of the Revolution is pretty straightforward about this. The idea that somehow the South wasn't part of the Revolution before 1780, whatever it was, or 1770 rather, whatever, before Saratoga, that's crazy, in my view. When I say insane, I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not going to stigmatize anybody in quite those long. It's simply at odds with the facts.
How did the Revolutionary War leave the institution of slavery?
The Revolutionary War itself, the fighting ravaged the South Carolina in particular, New Jersey actually was the so-called cockpit of the revolution. As Ken Burns' latest contribution with the American Revolution thing that he did a little while ago showed, it was a very, very serious war. And wars derange everything. And it certainly deranged the Southern economy in many ways. However, look, if you look at it from a somewhat broader standpoint, by 1784, three of the, well, now new states have passed abolition laws. This was not the case in 1776. By the time we get to 1784, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, and Rhode Island have passed legislatively abolition laws. Slavery is going to be more or less gone. Massachusetts almost immediately by 1783, and then New Hampshire in 1784. Vermont in 1777 had passed the first constitution in modern history, which abolished slavery for all adults. In effect, slavery is in retreat in large portions of the colonies by the end of the Revolution. It's not to say that it's over with. It's not to say that these laws are perfect, but it is in retreat that it has not been before. To see that as a sideshow to the Revolution, I think, is a mistake. And if you're going to talk about the state of slavery in the Revolution, you have to take that into account. So in that sense, slavery is weakened by the Revolution. It is quite true that this Constitution, that the slaveholders at the Constitutional Convention managed to find ways to, reinforce their power or to at least prevent the anti-slavery sentiments that were growing up in the North from having a national expression that protect slavery in various ways. But even there, they are compromises rather than outright victories. Is slavery stronger than it was? I don't know that it was stronger, in part because some of the things that the South was having to do, the Southern delegates were having to do, was in response to Northern emancipation.
When you say stronger, you mean politically stronger.
Yeah, I mean, look, later on, things are going to change. 1793 is a big year. And insofar as the invention of the cotton gin is going to matter in terms of the American experience of the second slavery, the invention of the second slavery, well, then things that seemed to be in place in 1787, 88 were going to be very, very different because you're going to be able to have a cotton revolution. You're going to be able to spread slavery to an extent that was impossible to imagine, really, at the time of the Constitution. But I'm skeptical of the idea that slavery came out. It's taken, I think, as an almost an oracle of faith that slavery came out of the Revolution stronger than ever before. I don't buy it.
As you mentioned, a lot of slaves ran off and were emancipated by the British. A British general in the North did something similar to Dunmore late in the war. So,
that's true. No, the Clinton rule, but a lot of those enslaved people ended up in Nova Scotia, where they were given,
terrible.
They ended up going to Sierra Leone. I mean, that's true, but it was not exactly a happy occasion. And then the Loyalist slaves, of course, ended up in the West Indies. Indeed, Dunmore himself ends up as the governor of Bermuda, overseeing a slavery regime.
Wait, I thought he was Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Okay. Look, the enslaved were looking for whatever chance they got to get freedom. Of course, a much smaller number, but some found their best opportunity by enlisting with the Continentals, with the Americans. Much smaller number, to be sure, but that's because the war in the South, most of the enslaved were in the South, and the war in the South is where the disruption occurred, and you're going to run to British lines. Makes sense. That's your best opportunity. But then there are those like Lemuel Haynes. I mean, there are lots and lots of very important Black abolitionists who were also patriots during the American Revolution. When I say lots, I'm not talking about hundreds, but I'm talking about some very significant figures. So it's not a one-way street in terms of loyalty. Sure. It's a question is, where was your best opportunity?
What did you think of the Ken Burns documentary? I thought it was good for what it covered, but it didn't cover much more than the war.
Yeah. I mean, well, look, Americans need to be reminded that the war was a war, that it wasn't a political science seminar about independence, that it wasn't just about a group of, many of them slaveholders, sitting around deciding to free themselves from the British. And I think for that, the series succeeded. There are other things that I would have wished the series could have done. The idea that somehow the American government originated with the Iroquois, I don't quite buy that argument. But for what it did, I thought it was a useful contribution by all means. And Ken is a master filmmaker. I mean, it's extraordinary how he can bring to life things. It's harder with the 18th century, of course, than the Civil War, because the Civil War, you had the photographs that you could do Burnsianism, which is to focus in on a detail and get things straight. It's harder, if you're dealing with 18th century paintings and so forth. He had challenges. If nothing else, to remind the American public at the 250th anniversary that what was unleashed was a bitter and nasty war, that's fine.
I had forgotten a lot of the battles that he covered, so that was interesting. But yeah, it was short on ideas. Jack Rakove made that criticism.
It is short on ideas. No, look, it didn't do everything I would have liked to have done, but I don't have his talents, so I couldn't have made such a thing. Yeah. I'm not going to, butt in where I can't butt in. military history is not exactly in good odor these days with American historians, because they think of it as, it's social history is all the rage still, and it's cultural history is all the rage. And you wouldn't imagine there was such a thing as a military conflict. And you think of it as, I don't know, pro-war or something, which is, of course, not the case, or needn't be the case. So by giving, that story a big injection of military history, I thought that was a good thing.
Yeah, the first history books I ever read were military history. John Keegan.
It's of an unending fascination, and I think that the general public actually is more interested in that than the academy is. But in the academy, diplomatic history, political history is still around, has to be. But military history is kind of not thought of as such a big deal as it used to be. And I think that, at least in terms of reminding everybody the importance of fighting, the Burns thing did a good job.
So, politics, activism, coalition building, grassroots, movements, protest. At some point, you have to get it into politics, and then eventually comes down to the business of legislating. And in your essay for the New England Quarterly from March 2023 about the radicalism of Northern emancipation or Northern abolition, you start off by citing none other than Ira Berlin in your first footnote, who, while he did recognize the importance of this so-called first emancipation, he also said it was a grudging attack on slavery, delayed emancipation for decades, sometimes generations, recognized property in man, confirmed the idea that freedom had to be purchased, shifted the cost of freedom to black people, and in some places provided direct compensation to slaveholders. Northern slavery ending with a whimper. Your article was a refutation of that. The fact that for the first time, property in slaves could be outlawed.
Well, I mean, first of all, let me say that Ira Berlin was a great historian, and I mourn his loss, and he taught me a great deal. So you stand on the shoulders of giants, and he was a giant, and I'm standing on his shoulders. However, when you stand on the shoulders, you can see a little bit further than they may have been able to do, pygmy though I am. Look, what gets missing, I think, from that is two things. First of all, that it was a political struggle going on in the northern states. There was a lot of pro-slavery sentiment. It's not that the emancipation or the abolition laws were grudging. It was a fight, and it was a fight that the people who were the anti-slavery people knew that they were going to get the best out of as they could at the time, and they did. So that's number one. And they didn't think of this as the end of anything. They thought of this as the beginning of a struggle. And in Pennsylvania in particular, where the first abolition laws passed in 1780, very quickly, both sides actually, the pro-slavery side tries to undo the act, and the anti-slavery side tries to extend the act. And that's going to continue and continue and continue.
Politics.
It was not immediate emancipation, but that was going to happen with the Civil War. You cannot judge what happened in the 1780s on the standard of what happened in the 1860s, a completely different situation. Immediate emancipation, immediate abolition was simply not on the cards. Indeed, even gradual abolition was not necessarily on the cards. It took a very prolonged, strong fight by the anti-slavery people to get that done. That's number one. So what you're looking at, you're trying to impute to the whole what the outcome was, as if the outcome was the entire story. The outcome was the outcome, but it was only a temporary one. It was one that was going to be contested further, but it was one that came about because of politics, as you say, Martin. It was a conflict, and so you have to look at it as a conflict rather than as near beer or as something that is not what you wanted it to be.
Yeah, the defenders of slavery certainly took it seriously. They saw what was happening.
They were furious, and they were furious at any kind of abolition. And the key to the second point in that article actually is that even though the abolition was going to be gradual, even though those people who were already enslaved are going to remain enslaved, although that doesn't necessarily justify the idea of property in human beings, it simply says that you cannot do that politically right now for those people. Nevertheless, it cut a very fundamental feature or element of the chattel principle, the idea of chattel slavery. Hold off on racial slavery for a second, just that chattel slavery exists. That the children of the enslaved are chattel. They are the property of those who are the owners of their mother, basically. That was broken. That idea was broken. Basically, it said the children born of enslaved mothers are not going to be enslaved. They're going to be, for a variety of reasons, they're going to be indentured servants for a period before they're free. There are lots of things about it that are not so nice. We would like to have been better, but nevertheless, the chattel principle was broken at its weakest link. And that had to do with the status of children. Now, you might say, well, that's, not the whole thing. No, but you begin somewhere, and you always begin in its weakest link. And it meant that, in fact, in time, there were going to be the children of enslaved people were going to be able to be free. They weren't going to have a great, easy life. They weren't all of a sudden going to be ordinary citizens. Many of them, they would not be able to vote, et cetera, et cetera. The women weren't going to be able to vote at all. But nevertheless, coming out of those laws, coming out of those abolitions was the growth of large and increasingly sophisticated Black communities, most famously in New York, Philadelphia, and Boston, of formerly enslaved people who were going to become the fulcrum for the abolitionist movement in the early part of the 19th century. Now, this is all part of the radicalism of Northern abolition. To diminish that, I think, is to misunderstand the process of abolition nationwide, but certainly in the North. So if you see that principle was being broken, that in fact, with the passage of many of these laws, slaveholders saw the writing on the wall. They figured out ways, but okay, we're going to manumit our slaves. Of course, these are the places where slavery was less established. But what do you expect? You expect that slavery is going to fall in South Carolina before it falls in Massachusetts? Come on.
And in
That's how
Massachusetts,
things work in the world.
Yeah, the Massachusetts Constitution had language that echoed the Declaration of Independence. Mum, Bet, and Quock Walker, two enslaved people, citing the Constitution in their state. Again, that was echoing the Declaration's Enlightenment, soaring Enlightenment language about natural rights. They successfully sued for their freedom. So yeah, the slaveholders were saying, you're using the government coercion. You're outlawing a form of property that had been lawful before. You can't do that.
Correct.
So this was a huge battle. It's a huge battle.
And outlawing that principle so that the children of enslaved mothers were not property. That denies the property right that people had taken for granted and assumed that it was the case. And they yelled about that. They said, this is no different than if you freed all of the enslaved right away. It's the same principle. The government is coming in and taking away our property. And by the way, that argument carried a lot of weight with a lot of people who were not involved in slavery particularly. They sort of said, yeah, that's right. Well, how can you take away a person's property? It was property in the old days. How can you make it not property? A lot of people went along with that. It took some convincing. It took a lot of struggle, but eventually, we got there. But to diminish the success of what they did, both as the case in Mumbet and Quock Walker, the judicial abolitions, but also the legislative abolitions, to diminish that, I think, is to turn things upside down. It's to judge the past on the basis of things that happened later, rather than to understand them as a part of a continuum. All history is a history of struggle, not necessarily class struggle, but struggle. And unless you see that and see that struggles do not proceed instantaneously, there can be setbacks and there can be advances and so forth. But unless you understand that over any major issue, then you're dealing in a world of moralistic judgment rather than a world of history.
And the next episode of History as It Happens will be the next installment of my America250 series as we head toward the semiquincentennial. We're going to be joined by H.W. Brands, and he will talk about his new biography of George Washington. That is next as we report History as It Happens. Make sure to sign up for my free newsletter. Just go to Substack and search for History as It Happens.